He despised her on their wedding night, but seeing her in another man's arms drove him crazy with jealousy. Now that she's moved on, he realized what he truly lost. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what happens next will touch your heart. The door to the bridal suite closed with a sound that echoed like thunder in the silence of the estate. She stood motionless, her wedding dress still immaculate, watching her husband walk to the window without even glancing in her direction. The scent of gardenias that saturated the luxurious space suddenly felt suffocating, as if the silk-covered walls were trying to smother her with their empty opulence. This should have been the most important night of their lives, but he grabbed his suit jacket and, with a voice as cold as the Carrara marble adorning the hallways, spoke the words that would shatter any illusion she had harbored. "I have urgent meetings, don't wait up." The doorknob turned again, and she was alone. The echo of her own footsteps was her only company in that immense space decorated with white rose petals that now seemed to mock her naivety. She approached the Venetian mirror hanging beside the Baroque vanity and contemplated her reflection. The dark eyes staring back no longer recognized the young woman from Charleston, who had dreamed of true love between the pages of romance novels. The marriage had been arranged by the traditional families of New York's high society, where business alliances were sealed with matrimonial bonds as ancient as the colonial churches that adorned the city squares. She came from a respected merchant family from Charleston, South Carolina, but facing financial difficulties after the crisis that had shaken her father's business like an economic earthquake. He was the heir to a textile empire based in Manhattan, known for his coldness in business and his reputation as a ruthless man forged in the corporate boardrooms of Wall Street. During their 6-month engagement, he had been distant but polite, fulfilling social formalities as one signs commercial contracts. She had clung to the hope that with time, that icy facade might melt under the warmth of cohabitation. But as she let the veil fall to the floor and watched the lace spread like a broken promise, she understood she had become merely another asset in his investment portfolio. The hours passed with torturous slowness. She didn't dare remove the dress, as if keeping it on were an act of silent resistance. When the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3 in the morning, she finally accepted reality. He wouldn't return that night. With fingers numbed by disappointment, she freed herself from the corset that suddenly felt tighter than ever and put on a cotton nightgown her mother had embroidered months ago, with hopes that now seemed to belong to another life. She lay on the matrimonial bed that seemed as vast as an empty ocean, feeling the weight of loneliness crush her against the Egyptian cotton sheets. The tears she had contained for hours finally escaped, wetting the down pillow as dawn began filtering through the burgundy velvet curtains. The following days revealed a routine that would become the architecture of her daily misery. He left before dawn, when the first lights of sunrise barely touched Manhattan's skyscrapers, and returned late at night, when she had already given up waiting for him for dinner. The estate, with its 15 rooms and marble-floored corridors that reflected the sound of every step like ghostly echoes, transformed into a gilded cage where luxury couldn't disguise emotional poverty. The household staff spoke in whispers, avoiding her gaze with a mixture of compassion and second-hand embarrassment. She could feel their unspoken thoughts floating in the air like dust, dancing in sunbeams streaming through stained glass windows. Poor Mrs. Whitmore. Their eyes seemed to say when they briefly crossed paths in the hallways. So young and already so alone. She spent mornings in the library, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather where books lined shelves reaching up to the vaulted ceiling. She lost herself in novels by Edith Wharton that her mother had given her before the wedding, seeking refuge in fictional worlds that offered more warmth than her matrimonial reality. Stories of characters fighting against social conventions resonated within her with painful intensity. The afternoons she devoted to the conservatory in the east wing of the estate, an oasis of marble columns and fountains where imported magnolias perfumed the air with a sweetness that contrasted bitterly with the acidity of her existence. She would sit on the wrought iron bench under the century-old oak tree and watch water flow through geometric channels, wondering if her life would always be as predictable and empty as that closed circuit. One October afternoon, As the maple leaves began turning golden, Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper who had served the family for 30 years, dared to approach with a tray of chamomile tea and shortbread cookies. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said with a cautious voice, like someone approaching a wounded animal, "forgive my boldness, but you look so pale. You should eat something." She looked up from the book she had been pretending to read for the last hour, her eyes revealing the accumulated fatigue of sleepless nights. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. You can leave it there, please." The older woman didn't move immediately. Her hands, weathered by decades of work, twisted nervously over her starched white apron. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you'll permit me. Mr. James has always been this way, since he was a boy, closed up like a vault. His mother, God rest her soul, used to say he had his heart in the right place but wrapped in barbed wire." The words floated between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. She felt something stir in her chest, a mixture of curiosity and resentment. "Has he always been so—" She couldn't finish the sentence, as if speaking the word cold aloud would make reality even more painful. "Distant," Mrs. Wilson completed gently, "for as long as anyone can remember. But there was a time, a few years ago. He seemed different, more alive. Then something happened, something he never wanted to tell even his own father. He came back from Charleston changed, as if they had extinguished a light inside him." Before she could ask more, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the estate. It was unusually early for his return. Mrs. Wilson hurried to withdraw with a slight curtsy, leaving the young wife with more questions than answers, and tea that would go cold untasted. He entered the conservatory with his tie loosened and his leather briefcase still in hand, as if he had forgotten to leave it in his office. The evening light created elongated shadows that made his figure seem even more imposing. He stopped upon seeing her there, and for an instant, so brief she almost imagined it, something passed through his eyes. Surprise, discomfort, guilt. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said with a neutral voice, as if commenting on the weather. "It's my home too, isn't it?" she responded, surprising herself with the tone of defiance that crept into her words. He stood motionless, processing the response. He wasn't accustomed to being answered that way. In his world of Manhattan business, words were strategies and emotions were weaknesses that should be hidden like cards in a poker game. "Of course it is," he finally responded. But he didn't move to leave or approach. He simply stood there, holding the briefcase like a shield. The silence between them was so dense it could almost be touched, interrupted only by the murmur of water in the fountain and the distant call of a robin in the oak tree. She closed the book on her lap, the sound of paper against paper echoing with unexpected finality. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but laden with months of unasked questions. "Do what?" "Marry me, if you so clearly didn't want a wife." The question hung suspended in the air like the scent of magnolia, sweet but with a touch of bitterness. He finally released the briefcase, letting it drop onto one of the iron benches with a dull thud that made the sparrows flee from the oak. "It was what both families needed," he responded with the same voice he probably used to discuss corporate mergers. "Your father needed capital to save his business. My father needed connections in the South. That's how our world works." "Our world," she repeated with a humorless laugh. "You speak as if I were part of a commercial contract, and aren't you?" The words left his mouth before he could stop them, raw and cutting like broken glass. She stood up so quickly that the book fell to the ground with a sharp sound. Her cheeks, usually pale, flushed with 2 spots of color that revealed rage contained for too long. "I'm a person," she said with a trembling but firm voice. "I have feelings, dreams, hopes. I'm not a line item in your accounting ledger." For the first time since they'd met, he seemed genuinely affected by something she had said. His hands closed into fists at his sides, and a muscle tensed in his square jaw. But when he spoke, his voice recovered its characteristic coldness. "I never said you were. You didn't have to say it. You demonstrate it every night you don't come home. Every meal you share with strangers instead of me. Every time you look at me as if I were just another piece of furniture in this house." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of indifference, but of words, fighting to be spoken, yet trapped behind walls of pride and fear. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if an invisible barrier prevented him from getting closer. "It's not that simple," he murmured. And for the first time since their wedding night, she detected something resembling vulnerability in his voice. "Then explain it to me. Make it simple. Tell me why you treat me as if my presence causes you pain." But he was already retreating, picking up the briefcase with abrupt movements, recomposing the armor that for a moment had threatened to crack. "I have work to do," was his only response before disappearing toward his study, leaving her alone again with the murmur of the fountain and the weight of answers that would never come. She let herself fall back onto the bench, trembling not from cold, but from the intensity of emotions she had kept repressed. "The cruelest cages," she thought while picking up the book from the floor, "are those built with indifference and decorated with luxury." The following weeks installed an even tenser routine. After that exchange in the conservatory, they began avoiding each other with almost military precision. She made sure to have breakfast after he had left, and he timed his returns for when the lights in her room were already out. The estate became a chessboard where two players moved strategically to never occupy the same square at the same time. But in a house so large and with so many mandatory social commitments, encounters were inevitable. One November evening, both were summoned to a formal dinner at the Vanderbilt residence, old friends of the Manhattan family. She prepared herself with meticulous care, choosing an emerald green velvet dress that highlighted the golden tone of her southern skin, and applying makeup with the precision of an artist restoring an ancient fresco. When she descended the main staircase, she found him waiting in the entrance hall, impeccable in his black tuxedo with a silk bow tie. For a moment, just a fleeting glimpse, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Admiration, perhaps, or surprise. But it vanished so quickly she thought she had imagined it. The car ride was silent, only the purr of the engine and the sounds of New York at night filling the space between them. She watched the streetlights pass by the window, wondering how two people could be so physically close and yet so distant in every other way. The dinner was an exercise in masterful acting. Both played the role of the perfect couple with synchronization that would have impressed any theater director. He pulled out her chair. She smiled with rehearsed grace. He commented on business. She nodded at appropriate moments. To the outside world, they were the image of high society marital harmony. But it was during coffee that something changed. The conversation turned to art, and Mrs. Vanderbilt mentioned a recent exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum about restoration techniques of American masters. Her eyes lit up involuntarily, a spark of genuine passion breaking through the mask of courtesy. "Oh, I would love to see that," she said with enthusiasm she hadn't shown in months. "I've always been fascinated by how restorers can see the layers of history beneath the visible paint." "You're interested in art restoration?" asked Mr. Vanderbilt with genuine curiosity. "Very much so. Before the marriage, I had taken some courses. It was my passion," she confessed, feeling the words flow with dangerous freedom. He watched her from across the table, with an intensity she could feel as physical heat. He hadn't known about this passion. In fact, he realized with growing discomfort, he knew almost nothing about her. They had exchanged basic information during their formal courtship, but had never talked about dreams, passions, or the things that made their hearts beat. "The Met offers a prestigious restoration program," Mrs. Vanderbilt commented. "My niece is taking it. It's quite rigorous, but fascinating according to her." She felt something stir in her chest, like a buried seed suddenly finding light. A program? Could she? The idea seemed ridiculous for a moment. A married woman of her position didn't need to study. But then she remembered the endless hours in the empty estate, the weight of boredom and loneliness, and the idea stopped seeming ridiculous to become an urgent necessity. On the way back, he finally broke the silence. "Are you really interested in that restoration thing?" She turned to him, surprised that he had initiated a conversation. "Yes," she responded simply, without elaborating. "Why did you never mention it?" The question was so absurd she almost laughed but restrained herself. Instead, her voice came out laden with fatigue when she responded, "When? At what point in our extensive and intimate conversations should I have mentioned it?" The sarcasm was so uncharacteristic of her that he looked at her with genuine surprise. He remained silent the rest of the trip, but she could feel his mind working, processing something he couldn't or wouldn't articulate. That night, lying in the vast matrimonial bed that had become her solitary island, she made a decision. If he can't give me purpose in this marriage, she thought, as the first lights of dawn began filtering through the curtains, then I'll find it on my own. The next morning, she woke with a determination she hadn't felt since before the wedding. She dressed in one of her most elegant but practical outfits, a grey wool skirt and an ivory silk blouse, and left the estate before the staff had finished preparing breakfast. The Metropolitan Museum rose before her like a temple of redemption. Its neoclassical columns seemed to promise refuge, a sanctuary where value was measured by knowledge and passion, not by surnames or bank accounts. With hands trembling slightly from a mixture of nervousness and excitement, she pushed through the heavy doors and entered. The enrollment process was simpler than expected. The program coordinator, a middle-aged woman from Boston with tortoiseshell glasses and contagious enthusiasm for art, reviewed her credentials with growing approval. "Your letters of recommendation are excellent," she commented, "and I see you completed preliminary studies in Charleston. Why did you abandon them?" "Family circumstances," she responded with the diplomatic ambiguity she had perfected in recent months. "Well, we'd be delighted to have you in the program. Classes begin next Monday. They're intensive, 3 days a week from 10 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. Will that be a problem?" For the first time in months, she felt the urge to smile genuinely. "It won't be a problem at all." She returned to the estate with a sense of lightness she had almost forgotten. She didn't tell him anything about her decision. Part of her knew she should, that as his wife she perhaps had some obligation to inform him, but another part, the part that had been ignored and set aside, rebelled against the idea. "I don't need his permission to exist," she told herself as she stored the course materials in her room's closet. The first day of classes arrived with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The restoration classroom was in the museum's basement, a surprisingly luminous space with high windows that allowed natural light without exposing the works to damage. There were a dozen students, most younger than her, some with a bohemian look that contrasted markedly with her aristocratic elegance. The professor who entered was a man of about 50, silver-grey hair combed back, hazel eyes that shone with intelligence and passion, and long-fingered hands that gestured expressively as he spoke. He introduced himself as Professor David Harrison, specialist in techniques of American colonial masters. "Restoration," he began with a deep, melodious voice, "is not simply repairing what's damaged. It's an intimate dialogue with the original artist. Every brushstroke we apply must respect the master's intention. Every decision we make affects how future generations will see the work. It's an enormous responsibility, but also an extraordinary privilege." She was captivated from the first word. She took notes frantically, absorbing every concept like dry earth absorbs rain. When the professor showed a colonial altarpiece with layers of paint accumulated from previous, inadequate restorations, she raised her hand timidly. "How do we decide which layers to remove?" she asked. "If each era added something, aren't we also erasing history by removing those additions?" Professor Harrison stopped, clearly impressed by the question. "Excellent observation. Your name?" "Emma," she responded, deliberately omitting her married surname. "Well, Emma, you've touched on one of the deepest debates in our profession. There are no easy answers, only carefully considered decisions based on exhaustive research and respect for the work's original integrity." At the end of class, while the other students dispersed, Professor Harrison approached her. "Your question was insightful. Have you studied restoration before?" "A little in Charleston, but I had to abandon it." "What a shame. You have a good eye for this. I hope you'll stay with us this time." The warmth in his voice, the genuine recognition of her capacity, was like balm on wounds she didn't know she had. She left the museum with her feet barely touching the ground. The following weeks became the rhythm that gave meaning to her existence. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays were sacred days dedicated to the course. She learned about historical pigments, chemical solvents, cleaning techniques that required a surgeon's precision. She discovered she had a natural talent for identifying the characteristic brushstrokes of different artists, and Professor Harrison praised her frequently. But more important than technical knowledge was the transformation occurring within her. At the museum, she wasn't the discarded wife of the textile magnate. She was simply Emma, a passionate student whose opinions mattered, whose ideas were discussed and valued. For the first time since her marriage, she felt seen. At home, she kept her new life secret. She left in the morning saying she was going shopping or visiting friends, and returned mid-afternoon with enough time to change before he came back, if he came back at all. Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and silent approval, but never asked questions. One afternoon, after a particularly exciting class about chiaroscuro techniques of John Singer Sargent, some students invited Emma for coffee at a small establishment near the museum. She hesitated. She had never done anything like this without an escort or formal social purpose, but the prospect of prolonging that feeling of freedom was too tempting. They sat at a marble table under a striped awning, the December sun creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed like a painting themselves. Professor Harrison joined them, ordering coffee and biscotti. The conversation flowed easily between restoration techniques, anecdotes from European museums, and passionate debates about whether it was ethical to use modern technology on ancient works. "I saw a Winslow Homer restored at the National Gallery," the professor recounted, "that had been damaged by smoke for 100 years. When we removed the soot layer, it was like seeing the painting born anew. The vibrant colors Homer had mixed with such precision, hidden all that time waiting." "Is the change always that dramatic?" asked Emma, leaning forward with genuine fascination. "Sometimes more," he responded with a smile. "There are works where you don't know what you'll find until you begin. It's like being an archaeologist, but of paint layers instead of earth strata." She laughed, a light and musical sound that surprised the others because she hadn't emitted it in months. The professor looked at her with approval, his eyes shining with something more than professional respect, with genuine paternal affection. "You should consider specializing in American colonial masters, Emma. You have instinct for understanding the light and shadow of that era." The words were like seeds planted in fertile ground. For the first time since her marriage, Emma could glimpse a future that wasn't empty, a future where she had purpose, passion, and a place where she truly belonged. When she arrived at the estate that afternoon, with rosy cheeks from the cold and bright eyes from enthusiasm, Mrs. Wilson stopped her in the entrance hall. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. James arrived early today. He's been looking for you." The brightness immediately extinguished, replaced by familiar tension. She removed her wool coat with slow movements, mentally preparing for the interrogation she knew would come. "But I won't let him take this from me," she decided, with newly discovered determination. "This part of my life is mine." She found him in his study, standing by the window overlooking the back garden, hands clasped behind his back in that posture he adopted when tense. He didn't turn when she entered, though he had clearly heard her footsteps. "Where were you?" The question was formulated with a casual tone that fooled no one. "I went out," she responded with equal neutrality, refusing to give explanations she didn't feel she owed. Finally he turned, and she could see there was something different in his expression. It wasn't the usual indifference, but something darker, more intense. "Out? Where?" "To have coffee with some people." The words hung suspended between them. She could see how he processed the information, how his hands closed slightly into fists before relaxing with visible effort. "What people?" The question crossed an invisible line. She felt something harden inside her, a resistance she didn't know she possessed. "Why does it matter? Why do you suddenly care how I spend my time when you've clearly been very busy these months, without wondering what I do during your long absences?" The blow was accurate. She saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, in how his jaw visibly tightened. "You're my wife." "On paper," she replied. "Only on paper. You haven't treated me like a wife since our wedding night." "It's not that simple." "Then make it simple," she interrupted, her voice rising for the first time in his presence. "Explain to me why you suddenly care where I am, when you've spent months treating me like a ghost in your own house." The silence that followed was tense, loaded with all the unsaid things that had accumulated for months. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if fighting something internal. "I saw your planner on the entrance hall table," he finally said. "The Metropolitan Museum, classes 3 times a week." So that was it. He had discovered her secret. Strangely, instead of feeling fear or guilt, Emma felt a kind of liberation. "Yes, I'm taking an art restoration course. It's something I've always wanted to do." "And you didn't think to consult me about it?" The indignation in his voice would have been comical if it weren't so revealing. "Consult you? Like you consulted me before abandoning me on our wedding night? Like you consult me about your endless meetings that seem more important than your own wife? It's different." "Why? Because you're the man and I'm just the decorative wife who should wait at home?" The words came out with a bitterness that had been fermenting for months. He seemed genuinely surprised by the vehemence, as if he had forgotten, or never known, that she had a will of her own. "I don't want you to leave the course," he said finally, and the concession sounded as if it physically cost him to pronounce it. "But I want to know who you're spending your time with." "Why?" The question was direct, challenging. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that was surprisingly human coming from him. Because you matter." The words came out with difficulty, as if they were extracted against his will. She stood motionless, processing what she had just heard. Mattered. After months of indifference, now she suddenly mattered. "You can't do that," she said with a trembling voice. "You can't ignore me for months and then decide I matter when I finally find something that makes me happy. I haven't ignored you." "No," she laughed without humor. "What do you call then months of absence, of indifference, of treating this marriage like a business obligation you'd prefer to avoid?" The accusation hung in the air. For a moment, she thought he would leave, as he always did when things became too emotional. But this time he didn't. This time he remained there, and when he spoke, his voice had a quality she had never heard before. Vulnerable, almost broken. "You're right. I've been unfair, but it's not. It's not because you don't matter to me." The words were so unexpected, she almost staggered. "Then why?" He turned to the window again, as if he couldn't say what he needed to say while looking at her. "Because you matter too much, and that terrifies me." The confession floated in the air like smoke, intangible but impossible to ignore. Emma approached one step, her heart beating with a mixture of confusion and something dangerously close to hope. "I don't understand. I know, and I can't explain it. Not yet." Frustration flooded Emma again. It was always like this with him. Glimpses of vulnerability immediately followed by insurmountable walls. It wasn't enough. Not anymore. "Then we have nothing more to talk about," she said, turning toward the door. "Emma, wait." The way he pronounced her name, not formally, not with distance, but with something close to desperation, stopped her. But she didn't turn around. "I'm going to continue going to my classes," she said with a firm voice. "I'm going to continue building a life that has meaning for me. If that bothers you, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to give up the only thing that makes me feel alive." She didn't wait for his response. She left the study with her back straight and head held high, though inside she trembled with the intensity of the exchange. Only when she reached the safety of her room did she allow the tears to fall, not of sadness, but of rage, confusion, and the exhaustion of maintaining strength before someone who seemed determined not to understand her. "Love cannot live where there are walls," she thought, as she let herself fall on the bed. "And the walls he's built are so high that not even he can see over them." The weeks following the confrontation brought a subtle but perceptible change in the estate's dynamic. He didn't ask her to abandon the course, but his absences became less frequent. He began arriving for dinners, though they ate in a tense silence, interrupted only by the clinking of china and crystal. Emma could feel his gaze on her during those meals, studying her as if she were an enigma he needed to solve. At the museum, her confidence flourished. Professor Harrison had taken her under his wing more decidedly, recognizing in her a genuine talent that deserved cultivation. He assigned her more challenging projects, allowing her to work on preliminary restoration of a small 18th century oil painting that had been in the museum's storage for decades. "See here," he would point out with his characteristic patience. "The artist used glazing to create depth. You can see how the light passes through the translucent layers. It's like looking through clear water to the bottom of a river." Emma would lean over the work with a magnifying glass, lost in the microscopic world of brushstrokes and pigments. The professor occasionally placed his hand on her shoulder to direct her attention to specific details, a mentor's gesture that she found comforting after months of almost non-existent human contact. The post-class coffees had become ritual. The group of students, now more cohesive, shared not only academic discussions, but also fragments of their lives. Emma, cautious at first, began opening up gradually, though always omitting details of her marriage. "And your family?" one of the younger students, Michael, had asked during one of those coffees. "In Charleston. I visit when I can," she responded with partial truth. In reality, she hadn't seen her family since the wedding, too ashamed to admit the failure of her marriage. "You must miss them," Professor Harrison commented with genuine empathy. "Yes," she admitted, surprised by the emotion that crept into her voice. "Very much." He patted her hand with paternal affection. "Family is important. No matter how much we immerse ourselves in our work, roots always matter." What they didn't know was that that afternoon, in a discreet corner of the cafe, a familiar figure was watching. He had decided to leave a meeting early, driven by a restlessness he didn't fully understand, and had steered the car toward the museum almost without thinking. When he saw Emma enter the cafe with the group, he decided to wait outside, watching through the glass. What he witnessed awakened something dark in his chest. He saw his wife laugh with a freedom he had never seen in her. He saw her gesture animatedly while talking about something that clearly impassioned her. And above all, he saw how that grey-haired professor touched her hand, her shoulder, with a familiarity that made something twist violently in his gut. It wasn't love, he told himself as he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. It was ownership. She was his wife. What right did that man have to touch her so familiarly? What right did he have to make her smile that way when he, her husband, hadn't managed to elicit a single genuine smile from her in months? That night, when she arrived at the estate with rosy cheeks from the cold and lightness in her step, he was waiting in the entrance hall. His presence, so unusual in that space and at that hour, startled her. "How was your day?" he asked with a tone that tried to be casual but failed miserably. "Good. The classes were interesting," she responded cautiously, feeling something dangerous in the atmosphere. "And after? Did you go for coffee?" The specificity of the question put her on immediate alert. "Yes, with some classmates from the course. Why?" "Just curious." But there was a tension in his jaw that contradicted the feigned lightness of his tone. Emma studied him, trying to decipher what was behind that apparently innocent interrogation. When their eyes met, she saw something there that made her pause, a dark intensity she had never seen directed at her. "Did you follow me?" The question came out before she could think it through. The silence was answer enough. She felt a wave of indignation mixed with something she couldn't completely identify. "You had no right." "I have every right. You're my wife." "On paper," she exploded. "How many times do I have to repeat it? You can't claim rights over me when you've spent months treating me as if I didn't exist." "That professor," he said, ignoring her explosion. "What is he to you?" The question was like a bucket of cold water. Emma stood motionless, processing the implication behind the words. "What are you insinuating?" "I saw him touch you. Too familiarly." The accusation floated between them, loaded with poison. For a moment, Emma was too stunned to respond. Then rage came, pure, clean, and incendiary. "How dare you? How dare you suggest something like that when you've ignored me for months? Professor Harrison is a respected teacher who treats me with more consideration and respect in one day than you have in our entire marriage." "You didn't answer my question." "Because it doesn't deserve an answer." She advanced toward him, her dark eyes blazing with fury. "You want to know what he is to me? He's someone who sees me, someone who values my opinion, Someone in whose presence I don't feel invisible and insignificant. That's what he is. The words hit like physical punches. She saw it in the way he recoiled slightly, in how his expression hardened even more if that was possible. I forbid you to continue seeing that man. The declaration was so absurd, so out of place, that Emma almost laughed. Forbid? Who do you think you are? Your husband. A title you've done everything possible to ignore until now. No, I won't accept orders from you. Professor Harrison is my mentor, nothing more. Though frankly, I shouldn't have to justify myself to someone who clearly doesn't trust me. And should I blindly trust while you spend entire afternoons with another man? Yes, she shouted, because that's what people who are supposedly married do. They trust each other, something we've evidently never had. The truth of the words resonated in the vast entrance hall. Both stood there, breathing heavily, the space between them loaded with months of resentment and unexpressed longings. I won't leave the course, she said finally, her voice calmer but equally firm. And I won't stop seeing Professor Harrison or my classmates. They're the only part of my life that makes sense. If that bothers you, you'll have to live with it. Or what? His voice was dangerously low. Or you can try to be the kind of husband who would deserve my consideration about these decisions. Without waiting for a response, she climbed the stairs with forced dignity, leaving him alone in the entrance hall with the weight of his own insecurities and the knowledge that, by following her, by questioning her, he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The days that followed were of Cold War. He increased his presence at the estate in a suffocating manner, appearing at strategic moments like an unwanted sentinel. When she prepared to leave for her classes, he suddenly had cancelled meetings and offered to take her to the museum. When she returned, he was in the entrance hall, asking about her day with an intensity that made every response feel like an interrogation. Emma refused to yield. She continued with her classes, with her post-class coffees, though now every moment of lightness was tinged with the awareness that she was probably being watched. The weight of that constant surveillance began eroding the joy she had found. One afternoon in early March, while working on preliminary cleaning of her restoration project, Professor Harrison noticed her distraction. Emma, you've passed the cotton swab over the same section 3 times. Is everything all right? She looked up, suddenly aware that she had been mechanically rubbing without really seeing what she was doing. Sorry, Professor, I'm a bit distracted today. He set down his own tools and approached with a concerned expression. Do you want to talk about it? Sometimes it helps to share burdens. The kindness in his voice almost broke the composure she had carefully maintained. For a moment, she was tempted to tell him everything, the empty marriage, the constant surveillance, the feeling of being trapped. But shame was stronger. It's just personal matters, nothing to worry about. The professor studied her with his wise eyes that had seen many things in his 50 years. You know I'm here if you need someone to talk to, not just as a professor but as a friend. He placed his hand on her shoulder in that paternal gesture that had become habitual. What they didn't know was that, from the administrative office window across the corridor, someone had witnessed the exchange. That night disaster struck. Emma arrived at the estate to find an envelope on the entrance hall table. She opened it with trembling hands and read with growing horror. It was an official letter from the Metropolitan Museum, informing her that Professor David Harrison had been reassigned to the research department effective immediately. Classes would be continued by another instructor. Understanding hit her like a physical punch. The letter was too convenient, too sudden, and when she saw the discreet note at the bottom mentioning a generous recent donation to support the research department, she knew exactly what had happened. She found him in his study, reviewing documents as if he hadn't done anything extraordinary. What did you do? Her voice was dangerously low, trembling with contained rage. He looked up with a cautiously neutral expression. I don't know what you're talking about. You know exactly what I'm talking about. She threw the letter onto his desk. You bribed the museum. You had Professor Harrison reassigned. I made a donation to support research. If they decided to use those funds to strengthen a department that needed it, that was their decision. The lie was so transparent it was insulting. Emma felt something break inside her. How could you? How could you be so cruel? Cruel? He stood up, his height making him seem even more imposing. Is it cruel to protect what's mine? I'm not a possession, she shouted. I'm a person with my own life, my own dreams. You're my wife, and that man is a respected mentor who has done nothing except treat me with kindness and respect. Something you clearly don't understand. I saw how he touched you. I saw how you looked at him. I look at him as a student looks at a mentor, like someone who genuinely cares, and I look at him with gratitude because he made me feel I was worth something after months of being treated as if I were invisible in my own home. The words came out with an intensity that made them both freeze. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by their agitated breathing. What I feel, he began, but she interrupted him. What you feel is possessiveness, jealousy, not love. Love requires trust, respect, consideration, all things you've proven incapable of giving. It's not that simple. Then make it simple. She advanced toward him, tears of frustration finally escaping. Tell me why. Give me a reason, any reason that justifies months of indifference followed by this sick obsession. Why did you treat me as if I didn't exist and now act as if I can't breathe without your permission? He looked at her with an expression that was a mixture of agony and something darker, deeper. Because I was afraid. The words came out almost in a whisper. I was afraid that if I let you matter, if I allowed you to get close, you would destroy me like she destroyed me. The confession hung suspended between them. Emma stood motionless, processing what she had just heard. Who? She asked with a trembling voice, but he was already closing up again, the walls rising back up. It doesn't matter. It was a long time ago. Yes, it matters, she insisted. If it's going to define our marriage, if it's going to be the reason you treat me the way you do, then it matters. I've already done what I've done. The professor is reassigned. You can continue with the course under another instructor. The way he changed the subject, evading her question, was the last straw. Emma felt something inside her finally surrender. You won't do this, she said with a calm but lethal voice. You won't continue controlling every aspect of my life. Never again. What does that mean? It means I'm leaving. The silence that followed was absolute. He looked at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. What? I'm leaving. To Charleston, to my parents' house. I need space to think, to decide if this marriage has any possible salvation. She saw genuine panic cross his face for the first time. You can't leave. Watch me, she replied. I'm leaving tomorrow morning. You can explain to your social circle whatever you want. Family illness, need for fresh air, whatever you prefer. I don't care. Emma. No, she stopped him with a raised hand. There's nothing more to say. You made your choice when you decided to control me instead of trust me. Now I'm making mine. She left the study without looking back, climbed the stairs, and began packing with hands that barely trembled. Part of her expected him to follow, to try to physically stop her, or at least offer the explanations she had asked for. But the night passed in absolute silence. The next morning, as the car she had called waited at the entrance, Mrs. Wilson handed her a small travel bag with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, are you sure? No, Emma admitted with brutal honesty, but staying would be losing myself completely. She got into the car without looking at the estate's windows, where she knew he was probably watching. The trip to the airport was a blur. Only when the plane began to move, taking her away from New York and everything she had known in recent months, did she allow the tears to fall freely. They weren't tears of sadness for what she was leaving, but of mourning for what never was and perhaps never could be. The family home in Charleston was exactly as she remembered, smaller than the Manhattan estate, but infinitely warmer. Her mother received her at the door with exclamations of joy that turned into concern when she saw the paleness of her face and the minimal luggage. Emma, sweetheart, what happened? I needed to come home, Mom, was all she could say before collapsing into maternal arms, finally allowing the weight of months of tension to come out in sobs that shook her entire body. Her father, a man of few words but great heart, didn't ask questions. He simply hugged her when her mother finally released her and said, Your room is just as you left it. Rest. Honey. The first days were of numbness. She slept long hours, waking disoriented in her old room with her adolescent books still on the shelves and the familiar scent of magnolia from the backyard. Her mother brought her sweet tea and homemade cookies, sitting on the edge of the bed as she had when Emma was a child and sick. "Do you want to talk about it?" her mother asked gently each day. "Not yet," Emma would respond, and her mother respected the silence. But on the fourth day, while having coffee on the family porch with its scent of jasmine and honeysuckle, her mother finally pressed gently. "Your husband called 5 times. Your father told him you were well but needed space." Emma felt something contract in her chest, hearing that he had called. What did she expect to hear? Apologies? Explanations? "I don't want to talk to him yet." "Is the marriage that bad, sweetheart?" The words, spoken with so much care and maternal concern, finally broke the dam. Emma told her everything. The wedding night, months of abandonment, the restoration course. The fleeting happiness she had found, his sick jealousy, the museum manipulation. Everything came out in a torrent of words punctuated by tears. Her mother listened in silence, her face reflecting every emotion, pain, anger, understanding. When Emma finally finished exhausted, her mother took her hands in hers. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. We should never have pressured you into that marriage. You needed the money to save the business." "Money isn't worth my daughter's happiness," her mother interrupted fiercely. "No amount of money. Your father and I have talked about this. If you decide not to return, we'll support you. We'll find another way." The words were like balm on open wounds, but they also brought a new burden, the guilt of having been the sacrifice that saved her family. The weeks in Charleston passed in a kind of limbo. Emma helped around the house, visited childhood friends who now had their own lives and families, walked the familiar streets of her youth. But she always felt she was in a transitory state, neither here nor there, waiting for something she couldn't identify. The letters began arriving in the second week. The first was formal, almost businesslike. "I hope you're well. The estate feels empty without your presence." Emma read it once and stored it in a drawer without responding. The second letter, a week later, was more personal. "I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. What I did with the professor was unforgivable. But you need to know it wasn't out of cruelty but from a fear I can't explain in writing." Emma read that letter 3 times before storing it with the first. The third letter arrived in her 4th week in Charleston. "I miss you. I never thought I'd say that. Never thought I'd allow anyone to matter enough that their absence would hurt me. But here I am in this empty estate and every room screams your name. The coffees we don't share, the dinners I eat alone, the matrimonial bed we never occupied together. Everything reminds me that I lost something precious before realizing I had it." That letter made her cry, not because of the romantic content, but from the frustration of beautiful words that came too late. "Do you love him?" her mother asked one afternoon as they embroidered together in the living room. The question caught her by surprise. She paused with the needle mid-air, reflecting honestly. "I don't know. How can you love someone who's never allowed you to know them? There are moments where I see glimpses of something more beneath that cold facade. Vulnerability, perhaps. Fear. But then the walls go up again and I'm left outside. And if he tore down those walls, I don't know if I know how to survive waiting for him to do that." Her mother set down her embroidery and took Emma's hands in hers. "Sweetheart, no one can tell you what to do. But I can tell you this. True love requires both people to be willing to be vulnerable. If only one person opens up while the other remains closed, it's not a marriage, it's a monologue." The words settled in Emma's heart with the weight of truth. That night she wrote her first response letter. "I received your letters. I appreciate the words, but words are easy when written on paper, and you don't have to face the person when saying them. If you truly want this marriage to work, I need more than written apologies and expressions of longing. I need honesty. I need to know who you really are. What made you so cold? What happened that makes you fear intimacy? Without that, there's no future for us." She sent the letter with trembling hands and wondered if he would respond with the truth she asked for, or with more elegant evasions. The response arrived 3 days later, not in the form of a letter, but as an unexpected visit. Emma was helping her mother in the small backyard garden when she heard her father's voice from inside the house. "Emma, you have a visitor." Her heart jumped. She knew, somehow she knew who it was. She removed the gardening gloves with clumsy fingers and smoothed her simple cotton dress, suddenly conscious of her casual appearance, so different from the elegance she maintained in New York. She found him in the family living room, standing by the window, completely out of place among the modest furniture and family photographs. He dressed less formally than usual, no tie, white shirt open at the collar, and there was something in his posture that suggested deep fatigue. He turned when she entered, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. She noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the several days' beard he hadn't bothered to shave, the tension in his shoulders. "You came," she said, because she didn't know what else to say. "I got your letter. You're right. You deserve answers. And some things can't be said in writing." Emma's parents, with the discreet wisdom of those who have been married for 30 years, excused themselves with the excuse of urgent errands, leaving them alone in the living room. The initial silence was uncomfortable. Finally, she pointed to the worn sofa. "Do you want to sit?" He nodded, and they both sat, maintaining careful distance between them. Emma waited, refusing to make this easier. He had come all this way, now he had to take the next step. "5 years ago," he began in a low voice, as if the words physically cost him, "I was engaged to a woman from Charleston, from a prominent family here. We met at a business conference. She was vibrant, beautiful, full of life. I fell completely in love, in a way that terrified me because I had never felt that." He paused, his hands interlacing and unlacing nervously. "The engagement lasted a year. I planned everything with her, our future, the family we would have. Then 2 weeks before the wedding, I found her in another man's arms, a business partner, someone I trusted." Emma felt her breath catch. Finally, a piece of the puzzle. "When I asked her why," he continued, his voice tensing with memory, "she told me I was too cold, too closed off, that she had grown tired of trying to reach someone who never opened up, that the other man, at least, knew how to make her feel loved." "I'm sorry," Emma said softly, and she meant it. "After that, I swore I would never again allow anyone to have that power over me. I dove into work, built walls so high no one could climb them, and it worked. For 5 years it worked perfectly." He turned to look at her directly for the first time since he began speaking. "Until I met you." Emma felt her heart accelerate. "When our parents arranged the engagement," he continued, "I thought it would be perfect. A marriage without love, without vulnerability, without risk of being hurt. But then on our wedding night, when I saw you there in that dress, when I understood you were my wife, I was terrified, because I felt something, and that wasn't part of the plan. So you ran," she completed with painful understanding. "So I ran. And I kept running every day after. Because every time I looked at you, I felt those walls I had built so carefully begin to crack, and that terrified me more than anything." Tears were flowing freely down Emma's face now, but they weren't tears of sadness but of understanding and mixed frustration. "But the walls you built to protect yourself also left me outside," she said with a trembling voice. "You condemned me for something another woman did. You punished me for her mistakes." "I know," his voice broke, "and I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry." "And Professor Harrison? The sick jealousy?" He ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "When I saw you with him, when I saw how he made you smile in a way I never had, I went crazy, because it reminded me of her, of finding her with another man. Except this time it was worse because I knew it was my fault. I knew that if I lost you, it would be because I had pushed you away myself. So you tried to control me instead of change. Because controlling was easier than admitting I was afraid. Easier than being vulnerable and risking being hurt again." Emma wiped the tears with the back of her hand. "That's not love. That's possessiveness born from fear." "I know," he admitted, "and you deserve more. You deserve someone who has the courage to love you without fear." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with everything unsaid for months. "I don't know if I can be that man," he finally said. "I don't know if I can completely tear down the walls I've spent years building. But if you give me a chance, a real chance, I'll try. I'll try to be honest. I'll try to trust. I'll try. Try, she interrupted. I don't need you to try. I need you to do it. I need a partner, not another restoration project where I have to remove layers and layers of protection to get to the original underneath. The words were harsh, but fair. He nodded slowly. Then I'll make you a promise. If you decide to come back, I won't be perfect. I'll probably make mistakes. But I'll be honest. No more secrets, no more evasions. And if I try to control you again instead of trusting you, you have permission to leave, and this time I won't try to stop you. Emma studied him, looking for signs of falsehood in his expression. But what she saw was fatigue, genuine vulnerability, and something that might be hope. I need time, she finally said, to think, to process all of this. As much time as you need. I'll stay in Charleston at a hotel nearby. When you're ready to talk, I'll be there. He stood to leave, but she stopped him with a question that had been circling her mind. Why now? Why did you finally decide to open up? He stopped at the door, his back to her. Because the alternative was losing you completely. And I discovered that scared me more than any vulnerability. After he left, Emma sat on the family sofa for hours, processing everything she had heard. Her mother finally returned, finding her staring into space. Did you talk? Yes. He told me everything. His past, his fears, everything. And I still don't know what to do. Her mother sat beside her, putting an arm around her shoulders. No one can decide for you, honey, but I can tell you this. We all carry wounds. The question isn't whether he has wounds, but whether he's willing to heal them instead of using them as weapons. The words resonated deeply. That night Emma barely slept, weighing her options, her feelings, her future. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, she thought as the first lights of dawn began filtering through her window. It's deciding that the future can be different from the past. But can it? Really? The following days were a delicate dance of careful encounters. He didn't pressure her, but he didn't disappear either. He invited her for coffee in neutral places, walks through Waterfront Park where the live oaks were lush, visits to St. Michael's Church where light filtered through stained glass created rainbows on the floor. During those encounters they talked, really talked, perhaps for the first time since they met. He told her about his childhood in Manhattan, raised by a demanding father who measured a person's worth by their commercial success. He spoke of his mother, who passed when he was 12, whose absence had left a void he never learned to fill. He revealed his doubts about the business empire he would inherit, questioning whether he really wanted to dedicate his life to textiles and mergers when he was secretly fascinated by architecture. Emma, in turn, shared her own abandoned dreams. She spoke of her love for art, that she had discovered on a school trip to a small museum in Charleston when she was 10. She told him about her grandfather, an artisan potter who had taught her to see beauty in details and understand that creating something with your own hands was a way of leaving a mark on the world. "Why did you never tell me this before?" he asked during one of those walks, genuinely confused. "When?" she replied with a sad smile. "Our courtship was formal, full of chaperones and conversations about family alliances. And after the wedding. Well, there was no space for that kind of intimacy." The truth of the words hit him visibly. "I've wasted so much time," he murmured. "We both have," she conceded. "I closed myself off too. After the wedding night, I stopped trying to reach you." It was true, and acknowledging it was liberating. The failure of their marriage hadn't been completely his fault. She had also built her own walls, though in defense more than fear. One afternoon, while having tea at a small cafe near Battery Park, he handed her a manila envelope. "What's this?" she asked cautiously. "Open it." Inside were official documents. As she read, her eyes widened with growing surprise. It was a donation to the Metropolitan Museum, but with specific conditions, that a full scholarship for restoration be established in her name, and that Professor David Harrison receive a salary increase and freedom to divide his time between research and teaching, as he preferred. "You can't buy forgiveness," she said, though her voice trembled with emotion. "I'm not trying to. This is to amend an error, not to buy your return. What I did was manipulative and cruel. I can't undo it, but I can try to correct part of the damage." She folded the papers carefully, feeling something soften inside her. "Thank you." That night, when she returned to her parents' house, she found another surprise. Her mother called her to the backyard, where she discovered they had installed a small restoration workshop. Modest compared to the Met's laboratories, but equipped with basic tools, magnifying glasses, solvents organized on shelves. "He came this morning while you were out," her mother explained. "He asked what you would need to practice at home. He wouldn't take no for an answer." Emma touched the tools with trembling fingers, feeling tears burn her eyes. It was a small gesture in monetary terms, but enormous in meaning. He had paid attention, had remembered what mattered to her, but the real changes were more subtle. During their conversations, she began noticing how he would pause before responding, as if consciously fighting the impulse to close up. She saw how his hands would tense when she mentioned returning to the museum, but how he would take a deep breath and say, "You should. It's important to you." One afternoon, while walking through the gardens of Magnolia Plantation, they passed a young couple clearly in the early stages of falling in love. He watched how they looked at each other with evident longing on his face. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "That we never had that. The early stages where everything is discovery and excitement. We jumped straight into a marriage that was dead before it began." "Maybe it's not too late," she suggested tentatively. "Maybe we can have our own courtship, a real one this time." The hope that lit up his face was like the sun emerging from behind storm clouds. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm willing to try, but slowly, as if we were two people getting to know each other for the first time, not two strangers forced into a marriage." He took her hand, the first time he had initiated physical contact without tension or possessiveness, and simply held it. "Slowly," he agreed, "at your pace, no pressure." The days that followed were of careful reconstruction. He took her to his favorite childhood restaurant, a small place in the historic district where they served the best she-crab soup in Charleston. She took him to see an exhibition of antique tiles, explaining with passion the evolution of firing techniques and mineral pigments. They began to know each other not as husband and wife, but as two people with histories, passions, and vulnerabilities. One evening, sitting by the fountains in Waterfront Park under the stars, he finally asked what had been circling his mind. "Will you come back to New York with me?" Emma had known the question would come. She had spent sleepless nights weighing it. "Yes," she finally responded, "but with conditions. Whatever you need. First, I'm returning to the course. No interference, no surveillance, no jealousy every time I mention Professor Harrison or my classmates. Agreed. Second, you'll go to therapy, and I will too. We both carry too much baggage to handle alone." He hesitated at this, clearly uncomfortable with the idea, but finally nodded. "If you think it will help, I'll do it." "And third," she continued, her voice firmer, "this marriage will be a partnership of equals. No unilateral decisions, no secrets, no power games. If we have a problem, we talk. If one of us feels the other is falling back into old patterns, we say so. Brutal honesty, even when it hurts." He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen before. Genuine respect. "It's a promise," he said, "and this time I'll keep it." They kissed then, not with the desperate passion of romance novels, but with the cautious tenderness of two wounded people who were deciding, against all odds and conventional wisdom, to try to build something real from the ruins of what never was. The trip back to New York was different from their first journey together months ago. This time, they talked during the entire flight. He pointed out landscapes that reminded him of childhood trips. She shared stories of summers at the beach. It wasn't the deep and painful conversation of revelations, but the everyday exchange of two people learning to be comfortable in each other's company. When the plane landed at JFK, she felt a mixture of apprehension and something resembling hope. Would the estate seem different this time, or would it continue being the gilded cage it had been? Mrs. Wilson greeted them at the door with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank God you've returned. This house hasn't been the same." Emma hugged her, touched by the genuine affection. "I missed you too, Mrs. Wilson." The interior of the estate was exactly as she remembered, but something in her had changed. She no longer saw a prison but possibility. It was just a house, and it depended on her and him to fill it with life or let it remain as an empty mausoleum. That first night, they stayed up late in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine and making plans. He had hired a renowned marriage therapist, someone specialized in couples with past trauma. Sessions would begin next week. Nervous? She asked as he filled her glass. Terrified, he admitted with a tremulous smile, but determined. The first weeks back were of adjustments. She returned to her classes at the Met, where Professor Harrison received her with a warm smile and no questions about her absence. He had been discreetly informed of the donation and the new conditions of his position, and though he had initially considered refusing them on principle, the promise of being able to dedicate himself to both research and teaching had been too tempting. "I'm glad you're back, Emma," was all he said. "We missed you." The therapy sessions were difficult. The therapist, Dr. Martinez, was an older man with half-moon glasses and an uncanny ability to see through the comfortable lies both had built. In the third session, he had them sit face to face and express their greatest fears about the marriage. Emma went first. "I'm afraid all this is temporary, that eventually he'll close up again and I'll be left outside once more, and I'm afraid that when that happens, I won't have the strength to fight anymore." He listened with visible attention, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. When his turn came, his voice was barely audible. "I'm afraid I won't be enough, that no matter how hard I try, no matter how vulnerable I attempt to be, she'll finally realize she deserves someone better, someone who doesn't come with so much baggage, so much fear." Tears flowed freely down Emma's face. "And I'm afraid," he continued, his voice breaking, "of falling completely in love, and then, when I'm most vulnerable, she'll destroy me like she did." "But I'm not her," Emma said fiercely. "I'll never be her. I'm not perfect, I make mistakes, I'll probably hurt you unintentionally sometimes, but I won't betray you. Not that way. Doctor." Martinez gave them exercises, daily check-in moments where they shared a fear or a joy, date nights where they explored New York like tourists in their own city, trust exercises that initially seemed silly but gradually began weaving connective tissue between them. There were setbacks. One night he arrived late without notice, and she felt all the old panic and resentment flood her. Instead of closing up as she would have done months before, she confronted him immediately. "You scared me. I thought we had agreed to communicate." The automatic defense appeared on his face, but then he took a deep breath, one of Dr. Martinez's exercises, and nodded. "You're right, I'm sorry, I got wrapped up in a negotiation and lost track of time. I should have called." "Yes, you should have." But her voice was already softer, seeing the genuine effort. They celebrated small victories. The first time he initiated a conversation about his feelings without her pressing. The day she could talk about Professor Harrison without seeing shadows cross his face. The night they finally made love, not out of obligation or necessity, but from mutual desire and the tender curiosity of exploring the intimacy they had denied themselves for so long. Afterward, lying in the darkness of the matrimonial bedroom that finally began to feel shared, he traced lazy patterns on her arm. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I almost lost this, that I almost let fear destroy something I didn't even know I could have. But you didn't. You chose to fight." "We chose to fight," he corrected. "Both of us." She nestled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you think we'll make it? Long term?" "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But for the first time in my life, I'm willing to bet everything on something uncertain. Because the alternative, a life without you, is more frightening than any vulnerability." The words were simple, but loaded with the weight of real transformation. They weren't grandiose promises of perfection, but recognition that choosing to love, choosing to trust, choosing to be vulnerable was a daily act of courage. The real challenge came 6 months after her return to New York, when she received an offer from the Metropolitan Museum. Professor Harrison had recommended her work, and they were offering her a position as a junior restoration assistant, a paid position that would require full-time dedication. Emma was ecstatic. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for, validation of her talent and passion. But as she read the offer letter in the privacy of her new studio in the east wing of the estate, she felt apprehension mix with joy. How would he react? They had made so much progress, but this was different. Not just casual studies, but a real job that would take her away from home for long hours. That would mean her primary identity would be as a professional restorer, not as the textile magnate's wife. She waited until that evening after dinner, when they were sitting in the conservatory that had become their favorite place for important conversations. "I have something to tell you," she began, her voice betraying nervousness despite her efforts. He set down his wineglass, giving her his full attention in the way he had learned to do. "What's going on?" She handed him the letter without preamble. She watched him while he read, seeing emotions cross his face. Surprise, something that might be fear, then visible effort to control himself. When he looked up, she was prepared for a battle. What she didn't expect was the tremulous smile that appeared on his face. "This is incredible, Emma. Congratulations. Really." The distrust in her voice was evident. He laughed, though there was tension in the sound. "Brutal honesty, remember? So yes, there's a part of me that's terrified, a part that asks what will happen if you get so absorbed in this new world that there won't be room for us, a part that's afraid of losing you the same way I—" He stopped, taking a deep breath. "But that's my insecurity, my demons, not your reality. So, you're okay with me accepting it? You don't need my agreement. This is your career, your dream. But if what you're asking is whether I support it, then yes, absolutely yes. I'm proud of you." The words were exactly what she needed to hear, but the tension in his shoulders, the grip of his hands, revealed how much it cost him to say them. "Tell me what you need from me to make this work for both of us," she said, taking his hands in hers. "Just don't disappear. Don't forget about us while you build this new life, because I'll be here, trying every day to be the husband you deserve, and I need to know that you'll also be here, choosing me even when you have other options." The raw vulnerability in his voice undid her. She moved toward him, wrapping him in her arms. "I choose you, every day I choose you. This job doesn't change that." But the following weeks tested that promise. The work was demanding, exciting, and time-consuming. Emma found herself arriving home late, exhausted but radiant, full of stories about colonial altarpieces and gilding techniques she had helped restore. He listened, genuinely interested, asking intelligent questions that showed he was paying attention. But she could see the effort it cost him, the way his hands would tense when she mentioned working late, the shadow that would cross his face when Professor Harrison appeared in her stories. He never said anything, never complained, but she could read the growing tension in the line of his shoulders, in the way he avoided eye contact when she talked about her colleagues. The explosion came from where they least expected it, not from him, but from her. One evening, after a particularly intense week where she had worked 60 hours on emergency restoration of a damaged Winslow Homer, she came home to find dinner prepared, candles lit, and him waiting in the formal dining room. "I thought you deserved a special evening," he explained with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Something in Emma broke. All the tension of maintaining the perfect balance between her career and her marriage, of trying to be enough in both worlds, exploded. "Why?" she asked, her voice rising. "Why do I feel like I have to compensate you for doing something I love? Why every time I arrive late? I see that look on your face as if I had betrayed you." The surprise on his expression was genuine. "I don't. I'm not. Yes, you are. You say you support me. You say you're proud. But I can feel your resentment. I can feel that part of you wishes I had never accepted this job." The silence that followed was heavy. He stood there, words clearly fighting in his throat. Finally, he collapsed into one of the dining chairs, the perfect posture he always maintained vanishing. "You're right. And I hate that you're right." The admission disarmed her. She slowly sat in the opposite chair. "Tell me what's really going on." "I'm trying so hard," he said with a broken voice. "I'm trying to be different, to be better. But when you arrive late, when you talk about your work with that passion you never direct at me, all those old fears come back. What if eventually you decide that this life, this career, is more satisfying than our marriage? What if you leave me like she did? But I'm not her. I know. The frustration exploded from him. I know you're not her. But fear isn't rational. Fear doesn't listen to logic. Fear whispers to me that I'm not enough every time I see you shine in a world where I don't exist. Tears were running down Emma's face now, but they were tears of understanding and mixed frustration. So what do we do? Because I'm not going to give up my career, and you can't continue living with this level of anxiety every time I get absorbed in my work. He ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of desperation that had become familiar. I need more help, more therapy, maybe anxiety medication. I don't know. But you're right. I can't live like this, and it's not fair to ask you to limit your life because of my insecurities. The brutal honesty of the admission was both painful and liberating. They approached simultaneously, meeting in the middle, embracing with the desperation of two people who finally understood that love wasn't enough, that it also required constant work, professional tools, and the will to face internal demons, no matter how frightening. We'll get through this, she whispered against his chest. But you need to intensify therapy, and I need to be more conscious about maintaining balance. It's not your responsibility to manage my insecurities, he protested. No, she agreed, but it's my responsibility as your wife to make sure you know you're important to me, that this marriage is important to me. That night marked a different turning point. He called Dr. Martinez the next day and scheduled additional sessions. Also, for the first time, he accepted the recommendation to consult a psychiatrist about anxiety medication. It wasn't admission of defeat, but recognition that some battles required tools beyond willpower. Emma, for her part, established boundaries at work. No more than 50 hours weekly except real emergencies. 1 night per week reserved exclusively for them. No work, no distractions. They cooked together, watched classic American films, or simply talked in the conservatory about everything and nothing. The intensified therapy sessions revealed deeper layers. Dr. Martinez helped him see how his ex's betrayal wasn't about his worth as a person, but about the incompatibilities and communication problems of that specific relationship. He taught him techniques to identify when his fears were logical responses to real situations versus when they were ghosts from the past projecting onto the present. It wasn't quick or easy. There were nights where he woke from nightmares about abandonment, and she held him while he trembled. There were days where she felt guilty about her professional happiness when she knew it caused him anxiety. But they continued, choosing difficult honesty over comfortable lies, choosing to work on themselves and their relationship even when it was exhausting. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to truly change. 18 months after that devastating wedding night, they found themselves standing in the same conservatory where so many important conversations had occurred. But this time, there were significant differences. They wore simple clothes. She, a white linen dress she had bought at a Charleston market. He, cotton pants and a shirt without a tie. There were no guests beyond both sets of parents and Mrs. Wilson, who cried discreetly in a corner. The officiant was the same minister who had baptized her in Charleston, who had made the trip to New York especially for this. Vow renewal, they called it. But it was more than that. It was recognition that what they had before wasn't real marriage, but an elaborate farce played by two people terrified in different ways. This was the real beginning. The vows they had written were simple but profound. He went first, his voice firm though his hands trembled slightly. Emma, 18 months ago I made you promises I didn't keep. I promised honor, but gave you indifference. I promised companionship, but gave you loneliness. Today I make different promises. I promise honesty, even when it's difficult. I promise vulnerability, even when it frightens me. I promise I'll continue working on myself, on my fears and my wounds, because you deserve a complete partner, not a half-finished project. I promise that every day I'll choose you, not from obligation, but from genuine love. And I promise that when I fail, because I will fail, I'll admit it, ask for help and work to do better. Tears ran freely down Emma's face as she listened, but they were tears of joy, not pain. When her turn came, her voice was clear. I promise not to disappear into my work or forget that we're building something together. I promise patience while you continue to heal, but I also promise honesty when you need a push. I promise not to assume I know what you think or feel, but to ask, even when the question is uncomfortable. I promise to celebrate your victories and hold your hand through your struggles, and I promise that every day I'll also choose you with full knowledge of your imperfections and mine, because I've learned that true love isn't finding the perfect person, but choosing to work on imperfection together. They didn't exchange new rings. Instead, he gave her a small restored tile he had found in an antiques market, 18th century, slightly damaged but beautifully repaired, with gold lines following the cracks in the Japanese kintsugi technique. To remind us, he said with an emotional voice, that broken things can become even more beautiful when repaired with care and love. She, in turn, gave him a leather-bound journal with blank pages. So you can write your story, she explained. Not the version the world sees, but the true one. Your fears, your joys, your thoughts, so you never again feel you have to keep it all inside. When the minister declared them renewed in marriage, the kiss they shared was different from any before. It wasn't the formal kiss of their first wedding, or the tentative passion of their first attempts at physical intimacy. It was the kiss of two people who had seen each other at their worst moments and had chosen to stay anyway. The small celebration that followed was joyful and intimate. Emma's father, a man of few words, toasted with an emotional voice. When Emma went to New York 2 years ago, I feared we would lose her. When she came back to Charleston a year ago, I feared her spirit was broken. But seeing both of you, I see something more valuable than a perfect marriage. I see two people who had the courage to admit when things were broken, and the even greater courage to work to repair them. That's true love. Mrs. Wilson prepared a modest but delicious feast of traditional Southern and Northern dishes. They ate, laughed, and shared stories. Professor Harrison had sent a gift, a rare book on colonial restoration techniques, with a note, "For the best student I've had the honor to teach." When she read the note aloud, she looked at her husband, prepared to see shadows of old jealousies. Instead, he smiled genuinely. "You should invite him for dinner sometime. I'd like to thank him personally for seeing your talent when I was too blinded by my own fears." The words, spoken without visible effort, were perhaps the greatest gift of all. That night, when they were finally alone in the matrimonial bedroom, they had redesigned together. No longer opulent and cold, but warm and intimate, they lay in the darkness, simply holding hands. "Do you regret it?" he asked in a low voice. "Regret what?" "Everything. The arranged marriage, the terrible months, the hard work of rebuilding something that never really existed in the first place." Emma considered the question honestly. "I don't regret the outcome, us here now, but would I have chosen an easier path if I had the option? Probably." She turned to him in the darkness. "And you?" "I don't regret you. I'll never regret you. But I regret every day I wasted being the wrong man. Every moment I made you feel small or invisible or that you didn't matter. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for that." "You don't need to make up for it," she said softly. "You just need to keep choosing me. The present is more important than the past." They kissed with the sweetness of couples who have earned their intimacy through fire and emerged stronger. It wasn't the end of their challenges. Life is never that simple. There would be difficult days ahead, moments where old patterns would threaten to resurface, crises that would test their commitment. But they had built solid foundations now. They had tools, communication, mutual respect, and most importantly, the knowledge that love wasn't a passive feeling, but an active choice they made each day. 6 months later, Emma was promoted to senior restorer at the Met, put in charge of a prestigious project restoring several John Singer sergeants. The day she received the news, she ran home and found him in his study. "I got it," she exclaimed, radiant with joy. He stood from his desk, lifted her in a bear hug, and spun with her laughing. "I knew you would. I'm so proud of you." And in that moment, with his genuine joy enveloping her own happiness, Emma knew with absolute certainty they had achieved something extraordinary. Not a perfect fairy tale marriage, but something more real and precious, a partnership built on ruins, forged in fire, and held together by conscious choice and genuine love. A year later, they announced they were expecting their first child. The news scared them both. Were they ready to be parents when they had barely learned to be spouses? But it also excited them in ways they didn't expect. "We'll make a lot of mistakes," he said one evening, his hand on her still flat belly. "Probably," she agreed. "But we'll also do a lot of things right. And most importantly, we'll teach our child that it's okay not to be perfect, that it's okay to ask for help, that true love requires work but is worth every moment." In the conservatory where they had renewed their vows, under the oak tree that had witnessed so many important conversations, they planted a young magnolia tree, symbol in Southern culture of dignity and perseverance, but also of resilience. "So it grows with our family," Emma explained as they both patted soil around the tender roots. "And to remind us," he added, "that the most beautiful things require time, care, and patience to flourish." They stood there, hands intertwined, looking at the young tree that someday would provide shade and blossoms. It wasn't the end of their story. The best stories never really end, but the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter written not in obligation or fear, but in chosen love, conquered vulnerability, and the deep understanding that sometimes the best beginnings come from the most painful endings. They had started as strangers, forced into an empty marriage. Now they were partners, friends, lovers, and soon would be parents. All because they had the courage to break, the courage to heal, and the courage to build something new from the fragments. True love isn't finding the perfect person, Emma told herself as she rested her head on her husband's shoulder, watching the sun set over Manhattan. It's finding someone with whom you're willing to do the hard work of building something real. And looking at the man beside her, imperfect, fighting his own demons but making the effort every day, she knew she had found exactly that.